Hello, government students. Welcome to lesson 3 here of our virtual notes. And you should have your Unit 1 note packet out and be on lesson 3, the virtual notes, and be filling those out as we go as we look at the Enlightenment influences today. Okay. First up is Aristotle. He's not actually an Enlightenment philosopher, but this is kind of where he best fits in terms of individuals to talk about. And really, he's a philosopher from ancient Greece, right? So long before the Enlightenment, but really had a lot of important things to kind of bring up related to government. He really believed that government is really going to be like the power in government is going to be located in one of three places: in the hands of one person, in the hands of a small group of people, the few, or the hands of the many, right, the general population. And based off of who had the power, there were two ways you could go with this. Okay? You could go with the person and the people, or the people in power working for the good of themselves or for the good of the state. Okay? So if a person if you had one person in charge and they were working towards the good of the state, he called that monarchy, right? And he looked very favorably on a monarchy. If that one person was in charge but working for the good of themselves, he called that tyranny, right? He called that person a tyrant. If you had a small group of people in charge, he called that, and they were working for the good of themselves, he called that an aristocracy. Okay? An aristocracy, usually this is wealthy people looking for the good of themselves. But if they were working towards the good of the state rather than their own benefit, he called that an oligarchy. Okay? So again, some of those terms should sound a little familiar. If the people were in charge, okay, and they were working for their own benefit only trying to figure out what they could get from government, he called that democracy. And he did not look very favorably upon democracy, instead looked at this as mob rule, where the majority basically took what they wanted. Not a very favorable look on that. What he preferred, if the many were in charge, was instead polity, where the people respected the rights of others. And this is much more similar. We have ideas that are going to develop in the Enlightenment with the respect of individuals and their rights. Okay, Aristotle himself preferred monarchy if you could find a citizen who was willing to rule and make decisions that benefited everyone. But he also realized monarchs quickly turn into tyrants, because it's really easy to make decisions that benefit yourself when you have all the power. Okay, uh, so in practice, he tended to lean towards that polity, keep the power in the hands of many people, but make sure that they're respecting the rights of others. Okay, that brings us to the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment doesn't begin until the 17th century. That's the 1600s. Okay, we'll move into the 18th century, the 1700s as well, but it really starts then, and that's where philosophers are starting to look at the system of government in Europe at the time, which was all built on the divine right of kings theory. You had a lot of monarchs who were claiming they were ruling because God put them there, okay, and that you had to obey them because by obeying them you obeyed God. Okay? And they started to look at that system and said, you know what, that's not really a good basis for government. Okay, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Religion was starting to become less of a major influence. Okay, instead of being like all of a person's life, it was becoming, like 75% of people's life. They were starting to have other interests outside of religion. And as philosophers were looking at this, they were starting to say, well, if it's not God that is granting this king authority, where are they getting that authority from? Okay? And they started to use this idea of natural law to be the basis of power, authority, and legitimacy. Okay? And natural law are these unchanging principles that have been discovered through reason. You're able to think through a situation and use logical reasoning to come to a conclusion, and that this reason governs all human conduct. Okay? And this focus on reason, they began to apply that and to try and solve many of the problems that existed at the time in society and government. And this use of reason and use of natural law becomes known as the Enlightenment. And it's really important because it really changes how society functions. Okay? You have a major shift that occurs that's going to alter the foundations of governments throughout Europe and the United States, and eventually throughout the world, as we'll see. Okay? As you start to have democracies become much more prevalent. So we've got to start somewhere. So we're going to start with this guy right here, Thomas Hobbes. And I'm not going to lie, he's not the most cheerful of individuals when it comes to how he views people and government. Okay, he was a really influential philosopher, though. He believed in what was called social contract theory. Remember, we looked at that in our first lesson. Okay, that's where people and government kind of make a contract. Government, you can do these things in exchange. We'll give up some of our freedoms. The main idea, though, for Hobbes in social contract theory is that people are giving up their freedoms in exchange for physical protection. Okay, that's physical protection from those people out there from other countries who are going to come in and try and take over, but also protection from my neighbor so that he doesn't come and kill me and try and take my stuff. Okay, so protection becomes the real basis of social contract theory. That's why government exists. Okay, um, and it's really there to prevent the war of every man against every man, right? War of neighbor against neighbor. He to create this, he went back to this time frame before government exists, and he called it the state of nature. Okay, and in this state of nature, it was literally every man for themselves. And if you wanted something, the powerful come in and take it. And eventually, he said we started to form governments to try and get protection, right? You got a bully in school who keeps picking on you. Well, you get together with a couple other friends, maybe try to make friends with, one of the big football players or something like that who's going to scare that bully away. And you say, all right, well, hey, I'll come and support you if you come and support me when this bully picks on you. You're giving up some of your freedom. Okay, you got to put your, put your mouth or put your fist where your mouth is in those instances to protect that other person now, not just protect themselves. You don't have the same freedom you had before, but you now get protection against that bully. Okay, that's kind of how Hobbes says government's formed, and that's where he looked and said this is what government is all about. But he also looked at people and says, look, you're not capable of governing yourselves. If you like if you could govern yourselves, you wouldn't need government. He views people as this tendency to simply just act out of their own interests and take advantage of the other people. It looks very similar to like what Aristotle said democracy. It very looks like people tend to generate towards mob rule, right? Where they just want to come in and take what they want, and if they don't get their way, then they're going to burn everything down. Well, he didn't have a very good view, very positive view of people and government, right? Then comes along my boy, right, John Locke. He is my boy, and like Hobbes, Locke believes in social contract theory, but he says, look, Hobbes, you're coming to all the wrong conclusions here, right? Yes, government exists to provide to the safety and security of the people, right? People need to be protected, but it's not just physical protection. There's more to it that, right? He instead draws on Aristotle's ideas of polity and says, look, it's about protecting people's rights. They have natural rights, things like life, liberty, and property. Wait, that sounds familiar. I feel like I've heard that from somewhere before. Huh, weird. But these natural rights, life, liberty, and property, are what you're really protecting. Okay, when we say life, we're talking about like the physical protection of your body and your right to live. When we're talking liberty, we're talking about freedoms. Okay, and property is my stuff, right? My house, my car, my things, right? Those are what government exists to protect: life, liberty, and property, my natural rights. And Locke goes even further. Like Hobbes goes out and says, well, if government starts taking advantage of you in some way and you don't like it, tough, right? Because you can't govern yourself, so get over it. Locke says, look, if government's starting to take away life, liberty, or property, and they start to take away natural rights, well, then it is the responsibility of the people to create a new government that's going to protect those rights, right? We call this the right to revolution. And that's where he takes a big step away from Hobbes and goes in an entirely different direction. Okay? And he's my boy. We'll talk in class more about why John Locke's my boy. Okay? After Locke, you have a couple other philosophers who kind of build off a lot of his ideas of natural rights and such. The first one is Baron de Montesquieu. He is a French philosopher who studied a lot of the different governments in Europe, and he also believed in social contract theory, but instead his main focus tended to be on how government should be set up to protect life, liberty, and property. What's the best way to do that? Well, you divide that government's power up into different branches. Don't let any one person or even one group of people have all the power, right? Have some people only have legislative power, right? Legislative power is the power to, if you said make laws, nice work. Okay? Executive power is the power to enforce laws. Judicial power is the power to interpret laws. Okay? By giving one group of people legislative power and only legislative power, another group of people executive power and only executive power, and judicial power and only judicial power, by dividing those powers up, you limit the power of government as a whole. All right, but he also said dividing up isn't the only way. If you want to further limit power, give each of those branches a little bit of control over one of the other branches. Okay, and by doing that, you further limit it. We call that checks and balances, and we'll look at more of that in Unit 2. Okay, next is Francois Marie Antoinette. He was more commonly known as Voltaire, and he was probably one of the more famous of all the Enlightenment thinkers. He also believed in social contract theory, but was very involved in protecting individual rights. He was very witty and used that to kind of get a lot of popularity and bring those ideas up in a time frame in which the French were a absolute monarchy, and was very critical of the monarchy and of the church, because the church and the monarchy were working hand in hand in this time in French society. And he advocated heavily for the protection of individual rights, okay, from government and religious intrusion, because he saw that happening on a regular basis in France. Promoted things like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press. Those things were things that were very, very central to what Voltaire believes. Okay. Next up is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau, again, another French philosopher, but he's probably the more controversial. He's one of the more radical of all of them. In his book, The Social Contract, he was also a big supporter of social contract theory. He believed that society was being very too strict on placing limits on people's behavior. Okay? That these monarchs shouldn't have power. The only legitimate governments in his ideas were ones that were elected by the people. And since monarchs were not elected by the people, they are not legitimate governments, and you had no duty to obey them. Right? In a time frame where you don't really have democracies, that's a pretty radical idea. Okay? He believed that the aristocracy, right, the wealthy, would exploit the poor working class in modern society, and that he wanted to go about protecting individual rights as society started to become more interdependent, as we started to specialize in labor instead of each person be able to grow what they needed to survive. He also believed that individuals would be willing to put the good of the community ahead of their own interests. Now, in reality, I think we can agree that most of the time this isn't the case, but there are some instances in which people do that when they've been enlightened, right? When they've started to use reason and been educated enough to see that. Okay? So that's Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Last philosopher we're going to look at, he's not really a government philosopher, but really, really influential in the development of modern society, is a guy by the name of Adam Smith. He's an economist, right? He deals with the economy. And he writes the book, The Wealth of Nations, in which he argues for a free market system, okay, where the government should stay out of the economy and allow what he called the invisible hands and to basically run the economy itself. Let the market determine what the value of goods and services should be. Okay? He believed in what are called laissez-faire policies. Those are hands-off, where the businesses are allowed to operate with little or no government involvement. Okay? Make sure you know those philosophers and have those ready to go for class, because we're going to be using them to kind of compare and contrast a little bit and look at a couple of individuals, especially my boy Jean Locke, in a little bit more detail. All right? So I'll see you in class.